The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events, the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high-quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video aired has a special discount code for today only in the comments section with a link to the video offered. And to see everything we do, or if you want to receive notice of new releases, new products, and new events for artists, simply click the other link, which says, "See everything we do." Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes with Plein Air and Fine Art Connoisseur magazines. If you've ever been to a DreamWorks movie, you know the color and the light and the animation is incredible. Well, Mike Hernandez is a part of all of that, and he teaches you drama with color and light, important for any painter. Enjoy this segment.
Hello everyone and welcome to the workshop. My name is Mike Hernandez and today I will be painting in gouache. Just a little about myself. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California, and have been working for DreamWorks Animation as a production designer, an art director, and a concept artist. I'm also an instructor and have been teaching plein air for over 25 years. Today I'll be taking a painting that I've done before and I'll be breaking it down into steps. And I'm going to show you how I do that in gouache. Now let's get started. So what we got here is my setup. This setup is going to be just a little bit different from what I do when I'm outdoors plein air painting. Now just a quick discussion on the difference between in plein air and studio painting is plein air painting is done outdoors and on site, and that's usually where we do all the learning. All the lessons from plein air are going to be learned outdoors. But for what we're doing today in the studio, I'm going to show you how to take a reference photo and paint from that and create the same type of light and color that you would learn in outdoor painting. So this is what's typical for both plein air. The only difference is for studio painting, I'm going to be using this table as my easel, and I'm not going to be using a tripod for a setup. So we'll take it and break it down into some of the components here. So what I have is my palette. And what I use for indoor or outdoor is a Stay Wet palette, and this is a wet box basically. So when you buy the Stay Wet palette, they usually come with some kind of a sponge that you wet, and it'll come with a palette paper. That palette paper usually gets soaked for about 15 minutes to open up the pores. Then it makes it breathable, so that way you can put your paints over that palette paper and it keeps it wet. Over time, my palettes evolved to just using the sponge that comes with the palette. And the reason for that is I feel like if you just use the sponge to put your paint on top of it, it's a more immediate way to keep the paint from drying up. Now, no matter what you do when you're out in the field, these paints are going to develop a little bit of a film. So when I'm indoor, I can control that climate. But when I'm outdoor, I can't control that, so it's best to have a spray bottle just to mist over them every now and then. So now this sponge is wet, and what I've done is I put the sponge in and I put a bit of water in this until it pulls up. I then tip the palette to the side until I can no longer pour any water out in the immediate sense. When I put it back down, I know I have enough water on here, and you'll notice that the paints on the sponge aren't bleeding in. So if you use the sponge that comes with the palette, that's going to be fine. But if you were to buy yourself a different sponge, which is fine, you can get it at a supermarket. You just want to make sure that you're getting a sponge that is very dense and it doesn't have a lot of holes in it, because if you do, and it's very porous, it's going to suck all your paint away and it's going to be no good to you. So let's go over the list of the colors that I have in here. Everything in here, they're all gouache colors. And when I buy gouache, by the way, I'm talking about regular gouache and not acrylic gouache that comes with a polymer base in it. You don't want to be using that. So the regular gouache can be reactivated. Versus acrylic gouache, once it's dry, like acrylic, you can't reactivate it again, it seals. What I have here is permanent white. I've got a permanent yellow. You can also use a brilliant yellow or many different yellows. And by the way, these colors that I have on my palette aren't exclusive, but they're colors that I would typically use. I have a linden green, which I love. I think that's a great color for when we want to do warm colors. Not so much when we just want to do green grass or foliage, but I use it for a lot of earth tone. I also have here a marigold yellow, which is more of an orange in my head. And then I have a brilliant orange, which to me, again, is more of a warmer red. I have my ultramarine blue, my yellow ochre. I also have my, my burnt sienna, alizarin crimson, spectrum violet, burnt umber. I also have my permanent green, and then I have my cobalt turquoise, which is such a great color. And the last color I have here is my sap green. Now, if you'll notice on my palette, I mostly use warm colors, because to me, a great painting is mostly earth tone. It's mostly warm colors, not as many blue colors. Blue colors to me in a painting are gorgeous, but they tend to flatten the painting out if you're using too much of it. So I like to use a lot more of the earth tones, and I'll explain that as we go. So this is your palette, your layout of colors. As far as brushes go, I like to use mostly flats. And the reason I use flats is because I like to keep things very flat and graphic and basic. And I love to stylize my shapes. And having flat brushes allows me to create something that's a lot more graphic and it's a lot more iconic. So I love these shapes, and they are also great in blocking. So I use a 1-inch flat, and I'll use a 1/2-inch flat, and then I use a number 8 round, and then I have my pencil for blocking in my sketch. Now, one thing to talk about when it comes to your brushes is making sure that you're using acrylic brushes or gouache brushes. You can use a blend of acrylic/watercolor brush, but try not to ever use an exclusive watercolor, especially the real expensive pure sable brushes. Those aren't good for the way I paint in gouache. Now, if you're using gouache without any white and you're not building it up opaque, you use it in washes like a watercolor, then I think it's fine to use a watercolor brush. But for the way I paint as if I'm painting using oil paint. I like to build it up a la prima. So for that, I use acrylic brushes. And the difference is they're a synthetic hair. And because they're a synthetic hair, they're going to be a little firmer. So they're going to be able to handle the buildup of paint as we get thicker. So when it comes to a brush, you want to make sure you're not spending too much money on your brush. You know, I don't spend any more than $30 to $40 on, let's say, a brush like this, and then on the smaller brushes, anywhere from $15 to $20 on those brushes. For me, I always like to keep things simple. When it comes to the brushes, I don't go beyond this. I've been known to do a whole painting using the flat brush only. And the flat brush is going to be great for beginners because it's going to also help you in simplifying your shapes. We'll be in tiering, we'll be using mostly the big brush. We'll go down to the half brush, and then towards the end of the painting, I'll be finessing some of the final details with the round brush. Next we have over here is a mixing tray. This is just a straightforward mixing tray. What I like about it, different from the plastic tray, is you could, if you wanted to be economical, and if you're out plein air painting, you could fold this sponge in half and put your paints on this side and use the mixing tray on this side. But what I love about this tray when I'm in the studio is it's got a glossy finish, so the paint is going to mix faster and it's going to be smoother and it's going to give me faster results. So I like using the mixing tray, plus it gives me more surface area to mix from. Here is our surface, and I'm going to be painting on an 8x10 crescent illustration board. The reason I use crescent illustration board is because I build up my paint, like I said, like it's an oil or like it's acrylic. So it's going to get a little heavy. The illustration board allows me to do that. Now, I have been known to paint on watercolor block as well. Cold press watercolor block is fantastic, but I feel like that's better suited if you're going to be more transparent and you're going to be thinner with the paint. As you're going to see, I'm going to build up this paint quite a bit in certain areas, and the illustration board is going to be great for that surface. Next, what we have is our reference. So in talking about photo reference, this is a photograph I've taken from the image that I have painted from. I went up and painted in the North Forks Lakes up in the Sierras, and this is Brainerd Lake. And I took the photo around the same time I did the painting up there. And what's important about these photos and taking a photo and painting from a photo is understanding that photography tends to simplify lighting and it simplifies color. When you paint from outdoor lighting and from life, you're going to be painting from high key lighting and high key color. So what you're going to find is that there's going to be a lot more value and there's going to be a lot more brightness and color in your shadows when you're painting for life. You're going to see a lot more warmth, in fact. When you take a photograph, what happens with a photograph is it tends to collapse the shadows. The shadows go darker and the shadows tend to go flat in color as well, so they reduce to kind of a gray blue. If you look at my photo I have here, this is pretty blue because it's a photograph. But if you were to refer to the painting that I've done that we're going to be using for this demo, you're going to notice just how warm it is. So I tend to skew a lot warmer in my paintings, because I draw from my experience as a plein air painting, that knowing that when I paint from high key painting, there's a lot more warmth. And from your photographs, you're going to notice that, especially photographs like the Sierras and mountains, there's going to be a lot more blue in those photos when they get reduced. And blue is a great color, but blue is a nice color to build from a warmer palette. Blue is used to describe either those upward facing planes that the sky is able to hit in the shadows. Blue is also a good way to push and get more volume out of mountains that go much further away into the atmosphere and gain more of the blue hue. But for something like what we're painting, we're so much closer. This is an intimate painting. This is an intimate lake setting. And because of that, I want to make sure that I get a lot of that warmth that's in the shadows and a lot of the color. And then I want to see the blue emerge from that color. So if you put too much blue in the beginning, you're going to flatten it out. So the first thing I need to do is consider the composition. We're going to break this painting down into its stages. We're going to do line first. We're going to do a tonal. Then we're going to do color blocking. Then we're going to do texture finessing, and then at the fine, we're going to articulate the final details. So the first thing I'm going to do is our composition. And the composition is probably the most important part of your painting. It's like the architecture of a home. If you don't have a solid structure or a foundation, it doesn't matter how much color and decoration you put on it, it's going to collapse. It won't work. So I want to make sure is I put a lot of good thought into my composition, but I also don't want to put a lot of detail into my lay-in as well. There's a difference between a drawing that you do as a study and a drawing that you do as a lay-in for a painting. You don't want to give yourself too much information in the beginning of the sketch, because if you do, you're going to end up painting by number. So what you want to do is block in the essentials, the biggest, small, medium, large, and accent details in the composition, just to give yourself a base to build off of when you're painting. So the first thing I want to do is build my horizon for this painting. What I love about this subject, as I'm looking at it here, the lake, is the imposing wall of granite behind that lake and how it pushes down on the sliver of water. That's the stage that needs to be set. So I'm going to start out with saying my horizon is going to be probably somewhere down here. I'm then going to break my canvas or my surface into 4 stages here to make sure that I'm building a hierarchy on my composition and a bias. So I know that one of the first things that's pertinent to my composition is this one landmass that comes out here. I want to make sure it doesn't go halfway, so I'm not breaking the composition into 2s, because everything the viewer loves to see when they're looking at your painting is based on hierarchies, meaning things that aren't always so even, that there's a sense of movement and bias. So I'm going to put the first part of this composition down here that's occupying this part of the painting. I then know that it's going to stoop below, and I'm going to create the cast shadow for the base of this water here. And this is the base of that rock. Now, as I build from this, I'm going to build everything based on rhythms. Now, you can't have any rhythm when everything is parallel, when everything is straight, when everything is the same. You build rhythms and movements through the eye when you dance upon straights and curves and things that aren't parallel, thicks and thins. All of those things I need to keep in mind as I'm drawing. So it is going to be opposing shapes as well that make it interesting, how one shape opposes another, and the variety that the mind loves to dance across. So I've got a shape down here, then I've got this shape over here, which is going to be the rock fall, and then all of the foliage that's built on that rock fall. I then have shapes of trees. Now, as I study and I look at this composition, what I love about the trees is how some of those shapes look like they're leaning forward, and how some of those shapes look like they're plumb and they're vertical and they're straight up. So I want to play off some of the trees that want to lean forward, as if, almost as if they want to peer over and look into the water. And what I love about that is that it starts to create the narrative of the painting. You know, that this is this intimate moment. And when we look at the photo I'm looking at, the water is pretty flat. It's not necessarily lit. And in the painting that I've done, you'll notice that I created a theatrical narrative for where the light is most important. It's kind of where I want you to look. There's one moment in the painting that's more important than the rest. Those things I'm going to get into later when we get into the tonal and we get into the final color. But at this stage, I want to build upon all of those notions as I'm sketching. So I know that our eyes are going to be right here primarily, and I'm going to build everything based on that counterbalance. So I have this shape here, I've got a line of trees here, And then I've got rockfall back here. Now, if you're not careful, that granite wall in the background, it seems so important because it has so much texture, because it's so overly stated as a vertical shape. You see all the rock, you see all the cracks, and in your mind you're thinking, oh, that's a lot of detail. There honestly really isn't a lot going on back there. In reality there is, but visually there isn't, or there doesn't have to be. Do not ever be a slave to your subject when you're looking at it. Make sure that you take full control and full responsibility over what it is you want to do with this image. The image is just a suggestion, and you go from there. So for me, I know I want to keep my eyes looking here, and I think about all the lines that'll help carry my eye there. So I got a line here, and I've got rock here, and this curve will help bring my eye pointing down there. So nature has its way of figuring some of those things out for you, which is really great. I've got a shape that comes up here of rock and then down. So what I've got so far is a nice variety of angles. And again, like I said earlier, the more angles you get, the more opposing shapes and angles and lines you get, the more movement you're going to get in a painting, and the more the visual interest is going to maintain itself. So I'm considering this angle here, that straight against that curve, this curve against that angle, this angle here to that angle here. And you'll notice that nothing is paralleling. For example, I don't have a line here, I don't have another line here, or another line here. And the spacing is different. So I pay attention to those things as I'm sketching, because they're going to build the foundation for a solid composition. I also talked about some of those trees that are leaning forward. So first off, before I get into it, I want to block out the masses of those trees. And it's important that I don't make those trees too big, because if I make the trees too big, then the composition is going to get small. The landscape, the scope and scale of this intimate location, we're going to lose what makes it so grand. I want that wall to be really imposing back there. So these trees, they can't get too much bigger. But certain things I pay attention to as I'm looking is the distance of this rock from here to here, and then the tree that sits on top of that. Well, if I repeat this distance to here, I'll know the tree can go up much higher, and visually it'll look more appealing that those things don't flatten each other out. So I'm always thinking of some of my markers that I make, or bearings that I take in a painting, to make sure that I'm approximating correctly. And then I know I've got a tree here, and I've got a tall pine somewhere about here. And again, I'm not getting into any detail, I'm just blocking in all of these shapes, and then another tree that hides behind that. Then I've got some masses back here, a group of trees back over there, and they kind of climb up the wall and make their way out. So for me, a good painting will usually have an entrance and it'll have an exit. For me, I feel like the entrance comes in here, and you're going to follow either here or through here, and you're going to follow the light, and you're going to take up this ramp, and you're going to exit out that way. That's the hope. And that's kind of something that I'm feeling early on in the painting, and we'll see if it goes that way. So for now, I blocked in my masses of the trees, and I feel like the proportions are pretty good. When I first start the sketch, my lines need to be really light, just in case I need to renegotiate. I don't want to have to erase those things. So for now, that's great. Now I want to start considering the lean of some of those trees. So I like how this tree is the tallest tree in the composition, and it stands proud. It stands real plumb, real straight. But then these ones want to peer over and look into the water. That's kind of the way I see it. That's my narrative. I love that sense of how the trees are curious and they're kind of pushing forward. This guy's leaning forward. This guy behind him, he's also leaning forward as well. So I like the lean of those. And over here, we've got a lean of some shapes as well that feel like they're peering and leaning over. Feel it on this one as well. And then opposing angles. That angle here to this angle here, they're different from each other. So that'll create a sense of movement and variety and rhythm. You can't have rhythm if everything is the same. You look at a sheet of music and you take a look at all the musical notes and look at how they all move. It's beautiful. And for the eye in painting, it's the same way. You need to create that musical rhythm that keeps it interesting and appealing, because nature will do it for you as well. So these are going to be my snow shapes. I'll have a shape that's down here and brings our eye in that direction. Don't need to spend too much time up here. I know I'm going to have a group of trees in that spot there. So what I want to make sure now that I've sketched a lot of this is that I have a solid base for the lake, the base lake of the shoreline in the distance for this wall to meet. That is a strong, static line. You just imagine the weight of everything you've got going on here needs to end on a calm line. So what I love in line is that sense of straight and curves, rhythms, and then areas for the eyes to rest. Areas where there's nothing going on versus areas where you have a lot going on. Because what you don't want in a composition in areas that have everything going on simultaneously, then the eye just wants to look away. So I've got my base here. Got the lean of that line here. So I feel like I'm pretty happy with the base, so I'm going a little bit heavier. I'm going to curve out here because this shoreline is starting to come towards us a little bit. And I know we're going to have a tree down there somewhere. So all my angles feel like they're opposing, they're variety, they're not repeating themselves. The distances between some of these masses doesn't feel too even. Considering where the snow is here, I've got a distance from here to here, then this distance is much greater. Again, if they were even with each other, it flattens out, it stops the rhythms that your eyes need. And I'm going to have a trail of light through the water that's going to come out this way. And then the rest of these things we'll figure out later in the painting. So I just want to make sure that I have these things figured out first. Just make sure that you spend enough time early on in your composition to build your foundation, but not to render this. I don't want to put too much information and too much detail. Kind of feel like I'm getting to that point where maybe I'm going just a little bit too far, so I'm going to stop. So I do have a nice line where these trees are coming down. I want to establish that for sure. So I think that's good for now. For me, as I look at this and I evaluate, I'm feeling the rhythms, I'm feeling the hierarchies, I'm feeling the movement. And if you notice, my complexity is right here. This is where everything gets complicated, everything kind of pulls together, where lines are getting closer, shapes are getting tighter, and then everything else beyond that opens up to where the water is almost nothing. It's a dead calm. Those are good rhythms for the eye. That's a good foundation to start with. So from that point on, I can now move into the tonal. Now, the reason I go into a tonal for this, it isn't a complete value study for me. It's more of a way to figure out how these giant masses are comparing to each other. So I'm not going to do a complete value study, but I'm just going to block in some of those masses. And what I like to do is I use a base tone of burnt sienna and a lot of water. So you'll notice in the beginning of my paintings, as we start to move forward, I try to use a lot more water in the beginning. Hardly any white at all, if actually no white. It's a lot like oil painting where your foundation is very lean and then you finish very thick. And the thickness is usually where the light hits. So you build a little more textural interest there. So I'm going to do a fairly light wash over the entire painting. It's probably a good idea to just pre-wet the surface. And I don't want to overwork that surface because I have a pencil and a line drawing here that if I'm not careful, I'm going to lose it. Again, this is really weak and it's very faint, and that's great because I want to make sure that I take it down in steps. And that's fine. My pencil is holding up, so I still have my image. And then as that's drying, I can just start working into the next layers. A little bit of wet on wet is not a big deal. Kind of like a little bit of that process of hard and soft edging that gets created from painting wet on wet. And then as it dries, you'll get some of the hard edging. So for me, I know I have to block in this wall. That whole thing needs to go down. And the reason I use burnt sienna as a wash, you'll notice a lot of the masters in the early days, they used a warm wash like a burnt sienna or a yellow ochre or a little bit of an olive green or a earth tone for their base. The reason that's such a great idea is that it, first off, for value's sake, it gets rid of the white. And the reason I like getting rid of my whites is I like to work from the middle up and the middle down. What's intimidating about working on a white canvas, if you don't have a trained eye and you're just learning how to paint, the problem with working on whiteboard is you'll never know just how light or how dark you're supposed to go. So let's say you are painting a very beautiful seascape, and it's daytime, and you got the bright sun out, and the sky is bright, bright blue, and you got white clouds and everything, and it looks great. Starting from the white of that board, if you look at that sky and you look at how bright and how light it feels to you, you'll probably overestimate it and mix that color too high in value. So when you put it down on white, that correct value that to you in real life looks very bright is going to come out really dark compared to white, and so you're going to tend to want to mix more white and go lighter with it. Maybe you were right, but more than likely you were off because you ended up going too high. So I'll notice a lot of beginners tend to paint their painting from the white of a board, and what they end up with is a painting that's way too high key, it's too foggy, it's too light and too weak. Not enough weight for their values. So the only way to know that is to maybe get rid of the white and block it into at least a wash that gives you a 50% value range like I'm doing here. This is more like 60%. But by getting rid of the white, if you then mixed that blue color again and you put it down, well, on a darker color, it'll actually look light. It'll look like the right value, knowing that, oh, okay, well, the sky just looks light, but it's actually just bright. And there's a difference between bright and light. Bright is how you would describe a color's intensity, whether it's vivid. Light is to describe the actual value. So sometimes someone will see a tree in sunlight against a dark background and think that tree is very light, when in fact it's just very bright and it's fooling your eye. And if you don't mix it with enough value, it's maybe 80% value, it won't be the right color and you won't get that intensity. So people tend to overcompensate. So this is why a little bit of a value study is good, just to kind of get rid of the whites. So for me, as I move forward, I'm paying attention to, again, not the exact value, but staging my lighting. This is the drama. This is where everything takes place. That's where my light is going to move through. So that is the integrity of the painting. Distilled to its simplest elements, this is it. This is what the painting is all about. That integrity has to be there at the very end of the painting, that simplicity of that one piece of light, meaning this is my primary read. There'll be a few highlights on top of these trees and some highlights back here, but it's all going to be about whether you enter here and come up or whether you come down and exit out that way. But then you're going to dance along the way on some of these highlights of these trees. So for me, that's the lighting. And then just to reinforce some things, I want to reinforce the weight of my masses. A good vocabulary of all your masses are going to be your small, your medium, and your large shapes. And not only do you need to have those small, medium, and large shapes, but you also need to have the variety of those shapes so that they're not all the same mass, but they're not all the same shape either. Okay, so now I'm going to use just a little bit less water and a little bit more pigment so I can see just how graphic my darks are looking. And just a heads up for painting, when I teach in a more procedural fashion when I'm painting. When I'm painting for myself when I'm outdoors, it's a little more chaotic and it's a little more spontaneous and it's faster, but then again, I wouldn't be able to break it down and teach you and make sense of that kind of a process. So that's how I paint when I'm painting for myself. But when I teach, it's a little careful, more calculated, and more procedural so you can understand. And maybe what I'll do is a separate video on how I paint for myself when I'm painting outdoors, for an example. Okay, again, you guys shouldn't be thinking of finessing forms. I could think a little bit about stylization early on, and making maybe some of these shapes a little more idealistic. Depends on what kind of painter you are. Some plein air painters don't do anything with their landscape. They're more of a purist where they go out and paint. The way it looks is the way you paint it. You don't change it. You don't manipulate it. It is what it is, and you paint it that way. And I think that's a fantastic tribute to the landscape, and I don't see anything wrong with that at all. Because I work in the entertainment industry, I'm always manipulating and telling a story, and I'm always trying to control the viewer's eye, and I'm always trying to control the viewer's narrative, and their emotion in a painting. That's my job. It's what I do in the industry. So I tend to not cheat, but I tend to become more narrative and take more control with the landscape when I'm painting. So there's times when I'll paint a landscape just the way it looks and just kind of be more of a purist, and I think that's fantastic. And then there's times I'm a little more narrative with the process. And I'll take certain shapes, I'll move them around, even though the landscape is suggesting it's one way. I'll change it and maybe do something either a little more iconic or idealistic. Now, sometimes iconic and idealistic doesn't come off as unique because a landscape in and of itself is unique all by itself. So by changing it, you're not necessarily making it unique, but maybe you're making it unique to your statement. So again, nothing against the purity of taking a landscape and painting it exactly the way it appears. But like I said, for me, I always like to embrace and tell a story if I can, by kind of pushing and pulling on things a little bit. And I haven't gotten into that yet, but you'll notice, for example, there were things that I liked, and all I'm doing is I'm not necessarily changing anything that's going on as I design this, but I was thinking about the things that are there, and what I'm doing is I'm overemphasizing them. For example, in composition, I took these trees and I thought, well, that feels like to me they're leaning over the lake, and they're wanting to peer into the water or peer into the light. So to me, that was kind of a narrative and an idea, maybe something that was a little more poetic, maybe slightly overly cliche, I don't know, but I liked it. I thought that was it was a good thing to build on. And when the viewers look at it, they may not even know that, they may not even see that, but hopefully somewhere in there they'll feel that as an interesting element. But you, the designer, had that intention that hopefully when the viewers look at, they'll be able to enjoy, maybe not knowing why they enjoy it, but thinking, God, there's something interesting about those trees and the way it's painted. I don't know what it is. But you as the artist need to know. So I think for now, this is pretty good, as a base and a blocking of these masses. I could do some subtle things up here to the rocks. I'm not so concerned at this stage about my mark making, but you'll notice here, we'll talk a little bit about mark making and why I use the flat brushes. Like towards the end of the painting, I'll be doing marks like this. You'll see how I get, the paint is wet, but I'm choking up on the handle of the brush much further away, because what I'm trying to do is get the paint to striate a little bit, and I'm doing something where I push down at the beginning and lift lightly, and that kind of creates a hard and soft edge and a little bit of a raking effect. And that raking effect is going to come in handy when I'm starting to do simultaneous color mixing and color texturing. I'm going to do a little bit of this, but this is just to kind of build up on the background a little bit, and maybe for me it's more over like I'm warming up to some of my shapes and my lines for the painting. Again, this isn't a full tonal. This isn't the exact value structure for the painting, but now I can see how the composition is lining up. My darks are lining up. My masses, their hierarchies, their shapes, the distribution here. I'm going to feel like I might want to group these because it's feeling like a lot of repetitive big shapes in there. And what I want to do at this stage is start negotiating those things and saying, okay, well, maybe this shape groups up a little more with the masses next to it. So this becomes one bigger, giant mass. And I think that's going to work out better that this is grouped. And I love to group my shapes in the beginning, and that's something we're going to talk about throughout the process. There's going to be a method of grouping masses, grouping shapes, grouping colors, and grouping the value structure as well. So in the beginning of the painting, I tend to group all of those things together, meaning I bring my values closer together. I will bring the contrast and the differences between colors closer together and group those that they feel like they're all kind of in the same mass. And then towards the end of the painting, I'll start evolving color from that background and having colors evolve and grow from that common ground. The other great thing about having a burnt sienna wash, this is something I never finished talking about, but having this burnt sienna wash is that it's a warm undertone. Now it's not completely red and it's not completely blue, it's right in the middle, which is nice, but it's a warm earth undertone, and by doing the warm earth undertone, what it's going to do is it's going to force all of my colors to go warmer and to go more earth. So whatever grays I mix here, they're going to need to be mixed warmer in order to make sense on top of this color. So if I just put down white and I put gray on there, it's going to be too neutral. But the fact that I'm using a burnt umber background, which by the way, you could use burnt umber, you can use yellow ochre, you can use olive green with yellow ochre or orange, any of those colors just to get yourself a base. And by using those colors, whatever color you put over it, by contrast, is going to feel like you're going to need to mix it to go warmer in order for it to feel like the proper gray or the right color you're going to need to use. Because otherwise, if I took a straight gray and put it on here, it's going to look too blue or too gray. So then I'm going to need to mix more of this color or other warm colors to make it feel like it sits correctly into the painting. So there is my brightest part of the painting right here. This is where the light comes through. And I'm not going to come back. I'm not going to mix and paint up the highlights on this here because I can still see the integrity of what my painting needs to be. Like I said, I haven't really gotten into maybe designing these shapes a bit. I mean, you'll see as I've blocked in these masses, there's something kind of graphic about the way I've blocked the shapes because they're so simple, and I'm trying to keep things very simplified. When you paint in plein air or anything you do, it's always good to reduce the details. When I'm painting in plein air, I tend to reduce the details. Sometimes as much as 60% of the details are gone. I'm only painting about 40% of what's really there. And the reason I do that is by eliminating the non-essential, I'm going to leave behind the essential, because there's over 1 million things you could say about a given composition. You as the artist needs to choose one for the viewer and embrace it. So by taking away all of the other things that aren't important, you're leaving behind the essential elements. So in other words, by giving the viewer less of the details, you're actually giving them more. So that's why I like to simplify. And by simplifying it, in a sense, it creates a sense of style as well. And style can also be derived from your color, the shape of your compositions, your line making, your simplicity, how you create your shapes and your forms, how you lay down your mark making, all of those things. Style can also be derived from your mood and the type of storytelling that's indicative of your style when you paint. You know, style to me is being able to look at someone's painting and say, yeah, that's an Edgar paint. Like I know every time I see an Edgar paint, I know he did it because there's a style behind his mark making, his grouping, his intellect, but that he was also very intuitive with his painting. That I know that whenever I look at a painting, he had an intention, and every painting looks intentional. His designs look intentional. So in fact, if you get his book, which I highly recommend, Edgar Payne's Paint and Composition, it's kind of like a Bible. I don't like to call it the rules, but for beginners, I think it's a good diary of how to construct your thought and construct composition and color and light. And you get to look at his book like you're reading a diary, and how this guy was very intentional. He thought of the many ways to compose compositions, stylizing compositions like O compositions and Steelyard compositions, circular S, and figuring out what makes a composition unique instead of the same composition over and over and over again. As far as light, mood, as far as the line, the shape, the color, everything, all of those things he was responsible for. Okay. And towards the end of the painting, I start to think of ways to keep my eye where it needs, the viewer's eye where it needs to go. So, I know that I'm going to knock down a lot of these areas. Your eyes don't need to go up there. I know that they're going to be in this area, so I want this area to glow a lot more than the rest. I want to make sure this area gets staged appropriately to go dark enough so that way we can pop and see all those beautiful highlights off of those trees here. So if we wanted to, we can proof it real quickly. And I'm going to take some white. And we're going to get into color in a second. We're going to take a break in a little bit, and that gives me a chance to recalibrate and gives me a chance to clean my water out and give you guys a chance to take a break as well. But we're going to get into this next portion, which is blocking in the color. And you'll see what I've done here with my whites is, a lot of people always ask, how, one of the biggest concerns I get about people who use gouache is I seem to be having a hard time mixing highlights with wash. So I'll put down a dark color and then I'll try to build up and get a highlight, and why can't I do it? It just keeps going darker. Every time I mix white into a color, it drops and it goes darker every time. Why is that? Well, that's usually two things. One, it's because you're using too much water. And two, because you're painting on a porous surface, and that porous surface is going to soak in a lot of that water, and with it, a lot of the pigment's going to go as well. When I want to put down a highlight, what I do is I use a damp brush, a little bit of water in it, but I don't put any extra water, a damp brush, and straight out of the tube, I will take my color. Most of the color you're going to be using, by the way, once we start getting into it, is going to be white. So that's why white tends to be the bigger tube out of any brand you ever get. You're going to need mostly white. And when it comes to brands, get the best brand you can when it comes to white. I discriminate on certain colors for certain brands, but mostly it's that white. I can make any other color work in a painting, but the white is the most essential. For me, I love using like the Winsor Newton or the Holbein brand. Those are pretty good whites. And I know there's a few other brands out there that are great as well. But if it's a student grade white, it's not going to be quite as opaque and be a little more of a butter. So I like using the Winsor Newton. And what I'll do is I'll take it straight out of the tube with really no white in it. And that way what I'll get is that one single mark that gives me a light. And what you see right there is what you're going to get. Now if I took that same white and I used water with it and mixed water and tried to get another white, this is going to dry a little bit darker. Now that could work to your advantages if you're trying to layer. Some people like to layer and they put it down and it works in, and then they kind of build it up over time. I tend not to paint like that. I like to paint more opaque when I paint. So I like to build up the thicker opaque marks. Another thing we're going to get into once we start getting into the finishing touches, which by the way, this is going to be more of how I'm going to finish the last stages of the painting, the thicker, heavier paint. It's about putting the least amount of marks down at any given time, really chewing up those mark makings as we go. So let's take a look at this value study. And again, I feel like we're in the right place. The lighting feels like it's doing what it needs to be. My darks feel like they're darkest maybe right around here, which is where I want your eye to go. Like I wouldn't want to put my darkest darks out here. And again, this, like I said, this isn't a full value study, but it's given me an idea of how this painting is evolving. Once I start getting into color, I'm going to remember the things I'm discovering with the value blocking. We do want to gain some value for having some of the darker darks right here. More contrast is going to happen in this area for many reasons. For one, this is where the brightest bright is going to be. And then your darkest darks are going to be right around here somewhere. And for that, what it's going to do is your darkest darks are going to build volume. Your higher contrast of where your darkest darks and your lightest lights are going to come forward in a painting. As you go lighter in contrast, then that's going to build more depth and atmosphere. So some of these darks aren't going to be quite as dark as this. I'm not overly concerned about it too much because the distance from here to here isn't that great, but I do want to gain some sense of volume in the painting, so I will be hitting this with maybe a little bit more contrast, maybe a little more color on this foreground where the sunlight hits. And it just so happens that the light is really embracing this foreground rock more than it's doing anything back here. So by default, we will get more texture, more color, and more contrast in this foreground here. I could at this stage, I don't have to, but I could maybe block in those shapes of glacier in the background to see how they're going to feel in the composition. Again, it feels maybe just a little bit too early at this stage, but I'm going to do it anyway to kind of show you how it's going to work. I'm going to have it peeking through this tree here, and it's going to come down and kind of point to this area, which is nice. I've got this rail of glacier kind of riding in at an angle that maybe brings your eye into the painting maybe. It's another possible entrance for your eye, or an exit depending on which way you've entered the painting, to kind of come up this way, drop down, and come in here. Or you may enter here and come up and exit there. You may come down this way and follow that out. But it's good to think about your bearings and the things you're using in your painting as a way for the eyes to kind of travel. So I might like to come up here and then maybe drop down about here. I'm going to bring a little piece of glacier just to kind of return the rhythm instead of just sporadically putting highlights left and right everywhere. Another thing I need to be careful about doing is making sure that I'm not using the same thickness everywhere. I'm not spacing these out the same distance from each other, so that way I build the rhythm and I maintain the rhythm and the hierarchy. Otherwise, I'm going to have, if this line, and I did another snow line like that and another one like that, you've ruined rhythm in the painting and you've ruined the visual interest of that and the natural appeal of what happens. So I'm trying to take lessons from nature and learn from what it's doing. So, these are just placeholders, and you're gonna hear me use that word quite a bit, the word placeholder. I'll use placeholders for value, placeholders for color, placeholders for shape, knowing that I'm always gonna come back. In our next chapter, when I get into color blocking, the colors I'm gonna use are always just gonna be guesstimates and estimates of what that color needs to be, just to kind of get me in a ballpark, because I know that painting is gonna be a lesson in negotiating all those things. You won't be able to paint color until you have all of those relationships together. One thing I don't have here yet, and these are things I can discover towards the end of the painting, but I'm kind of foreshadowing them now, is some of maybe the smallest marks, like maybe that small piece of snow right there compared to these larger pieces. That's going to build and give you a sense of scale. It might be kind of cool as I'm thinking, either I put some sort of an island right here. I put a little dot right there, and the reason I did that is I tend to be very narrative, like I'm telling a story, like this is some establishing shot for a movie I'm working on, and I have a tendency of always doing that as I'm painting. It just kind of happens. I'll put like a dot, and that dot just kind of says, that's my character, and maybe we'll do that. Maybe we'll have our hiker, maybe this little landmass comes out a little bit and gives them something to stand on, and we'll build that this is going to be our hiker, or maybe a couple of hikers down there, and then it just kind of gives this whole painting a different narrative, and it gives it a different scope and scale. I want to make sure they're not placed right in the middle, but you won't really, even if I put them here, you wouldn't feel middle because of the bias of all these bigger shapes, so it would be okay if I did. But it might be nice that, as we finish the painting, I'm going to paint right over those guys and I'll bring them again. I'll bring them in again towards the end of the painting because I think it adds a nice appeal. It's always really great to add a little bit of a subject. For me in landscape, the landscape is the subject, so I tend to think of all of those elements as living. An example would be in this composition, without the humans, the subject is the landscape. It's the rocks, it's the trees, and then the water is the other subject. So I always try to play my masculine against my feminine, my hard against my soft, things like that, my warm against my cool. So in this one here, for example, the rock is the masculine, it's the male, it's all the angles and those jagged edges and whatnot. And then the feminine is the water, and the water is going to be that jewel and that gem. It's going to have that depth and sparkle like a crystal will have in it. And so I want to play those opposing elements together in the end of the painting. So I think this is a good time for a break. We'll finish up here with the tonal, and then I'll refresh some of my colors in my palette, and we'll get into the next chapter, which will be blocking in the colors. All right, welcome back, everyone. So we just finished up with our tone and our blocking for this composition, and the next stage I want to get into is going to be our color blocking. So in the color blocking, again, we'll keep it really simple, and that's why I broke this down into stages for you guys, because it's so important that in the very beginning of the process, you don't start thinking about too many of the details. You don't start thinking about the finishing. You don't start thinking about the things. And in fact, whenever it gets to painting anything that's a landscape, I never think about the things at all. And the things meaning like the smaller details, the leaves and the branches and the texture of the rocks. I don't think of those things. I think of the masses of color and the shapes of light and the relationships of all of those colors to each other. So I'm going to talk a little bit about gouache and why gouache and what it is, and why I chose to work with it. I started out as an oil painter and painted exclusively with oils for quite some time. I used to paint large oil paintings, and then once I started teaching in college, I had a lot of leftover gouache paints, and I decided to incorporate them into the teaching in my class. And I noticed that the students, once they started using the gouache, the learning curve increased. And the reason for that was that they were no longer struggling with, as a beginner, how to use oil and the application of oil. Gouache was just a little bit cleaner. And gouache does have its set of challenges as well, but I feel like in oil, the challenges were maybe greater for those students, where they were building up and getting a little bit too thick. And so they were struggling with the application instead of struggling with the more important things, which was edge control, color, value, and lighting. All those things were more important. And I noticed that students were able to comprehend the things I was trying to teach them by using gouache as a medium. Now, I don't know if this is going to be true for everyone else, but I just felt like, okay, well, in using oils myself and in teaching with oils, I also noticed that gouache, the way I paint with gouache, because it's so opaque and I build it up kind of thick, it's easier to paint smaller with gouache. Now, if you're going to paint gouache like you're painting a watercolor, well then you can paint as large as you want. You can spread it in with as many washes as you want, with as much water as you want to spend. But when you paint kind of thick like I'm painting, for me, my comfort size is like 5x7, 6x8, 8x10, 9x12 at the largest. It doesn't, especially if I'm out painting in plein air. If I want to do a studio painting any larger, like 11x17, it's fine. But for plein air, it doesn't spread quite as well if you're building it up and painting like it's an oil. At that size, you might as well just use an oil. But the reason I started using gouache in the class is I noticed, okay, well, we can paint smaller. And over the course of 25 years of teaching, I've learned that it's best to paint smaller and to paint more often within any given time. Paint with a much larger brush and with a smaller palette and a smaller amount of time. We call it the magic hour, or the magic 45-minute window, where as a beginner, you only have 45 minutes to learn everything you're going to need to know about the view you're looking at. After 45 minutes, you're going to lose that visual freshness, and it's time to move on to the next painting. So because of that, it's better to paint much smaller. And with gouache, you tend to want to paint 4x6, 5x7, something really small. That's a comfortable size. And stick with the large brush. Simplify all of the details and simplify the light. So I noticed the students were learning this a lot faster. And for me, once I got into working in the industry as a production designer, art director, that window for time for me to get out and paint became smaller. And then I only had time to paint in the morning, paint at lunch, paint after work. So gouache was much more portable for me. And I know that you could probably get a really great portable oil setup as well, and that works. But for me, the gouache was simple. I can keep my clothes clean, and a lot of times when it was hot, I would paint in the car. So the setup was really fast, and it was simple. And when the setup is smaller and it's easier, you're more likely to get out and paint. And so that's what I liked about using the gouache. The difference between gouache and any other medium is that gouache is, unlike like watercolor, it's a transparent medium. And in fact, it is a watercolor. The only difference is it's a watercolor that has pigment that's been based with acrylic is gouache. Acrylic is basically a gouache that has polymer added to it to become more of a plastic. But gouache is also like a watercolor. The only difference is watercolor has no white added to it. Watercolor has the highest spectral rating out of any medium, meaning that if you took a spectrometer, a gun that measures color, you're going to get the most color out of watercolor. Gouache, the minute you added white to it and it became an opaque medium, has less spectrum on it, but it's richer because it has more body in it. The difference between a gouache and an acrylic is that gouache you can reactivate. Once it dries, you add water to it, it'll reactivate, versus acrylic, it doesn't. Another way to use this setup if you're more of a watercolorist and you want to try gouache is keep your watercolors and just add a tube of white gouache to your watercolors. Paint everything you do in watercolor and then add white to start getting a buildup of more opaque color. But I became used to using gouache over the years, so it's just kind of become my one medium. I'm used to the things it does and doesn't do. When it dries, it tends to dry a little flat. The finish is flat, so it doesn't go quite as dark and as rich as an oil painting does. But it's a good tool. So for example, if you are an oil painter, gouache is nice. It's more immediate for you to get out, maybe to do some quick studies, and that way you can go back and either do some oil paintings in the studio or gouache warm-ups before you do your bigger oil painting as well. So now we're going to move on to the color blocking. And looking back at my composition, I kind of feel like I like where it's going. There's definitely some things I'm going to renegotiate as I go, and that's what's great about this medium is you can kind of renegotiate. It's not like watercolor where you have to kind of put down your shapes and predetermine what they're going to look like. I try to do a little bit of that in the beginning. I kept this very transparent, but I can renegotiate and I can build up and I can cut into shape, I can add and I can subtract. In the beginning, for the color blocking, what's important is that we get a guesstimate or an estimation of what color we're going to need, but we want to hurry up and block in something as a placeholder and start building relationships. I don't want to try to aim to find the right color, and in fact, it would probably be impossible for me to get the right exact color without knowing what the other colors are going to be next to it. It is relationships that make color, so you wouldn't really know what you have until you put the puzzle pieces down. But again, we're not going to go too far ahead, so I'm going to start, and I'm going to keep things fairly wet again, and I want to start building in some of the puzzle pieces. So I'm going to start with the bigger, broader shapes, a lot of that concrete and that granite back there. And I'm not just going to make a gray, so I'm going to start in with my yellow ochre and my burnt umber, some of my green, my cool green, a little bit of my turquoise, and some white. I'm going to put a lot of almost every color in here because I'm trying to get to gray, which is what I'm doing. And the gray that I'm going to create is going to be warm, so when you see it on my palette, you're going to see a warm gray. Like right now, this is very cool, and it'll look green compared to red because it's a complement. So that tells me, even though it's kind of gray here, a little bit green, it's going to be very green there, which tells me, okay, I need to start going towards oranges and reds to kind of even it out and balance it out. And once I do that, it takes away some of that green. So this might be a good base color to start with. And I always go very, very, very warm when I start my paintings. So this is a very, very warm gray. And again, resist that urge to do too much detail and resist the urge to put too much blue into the painting. And this is very transparent, so you'll see once it starts to dry, you'll see some of that burnt sienna coming through as an underpainting, and I love that. that burnt sienna is going to permeate through a lot of the painting. And I love to let that undertone breathe a little bit. I know that there are light variations, there are textures in the rock back here. I'm not even thinking about any of that right now. I'm just trying to hurry up, and I'm trying to get a base color to start with. Not doing any warm and cool modeling with it. I don't even know if I have the right color or the right value yet. I just need to put it down and then start building all the other pieces to key off of that. You need to key off of those things to let yourself know where you need to go. Now, if I had sketched out way more detail back there, I wouldn't be able to move as fast as I'm moving now. It would have been a paint by number situation. That's why it's important not to put too much in the beginning of your painting so you have the freedom to move. Let's mix up a little bit more. And what's great about estimating where you are and, is knowing that you're going to renegotiate this stuff later, and you don't have to be perfect in the beginning. And the right mindset for something like this is to always tell yourself that, don't ever set yourself up for failure for thinking this is going to be the most amazing painting, or that this is going to be a one of a kind and you only have one shot at doing this. You don't. For me, I kind of do, because this is my demo. But in reality, every painting is just a study. And when you set your mindset at that it's just a study, it's just paint, and it's only one of, if not thousands of paintings you're going to do in your lifetime, then you relieve yourself of that burden of thinking that it has to be perfect. Meaning, if you've relieved yourself of that, then you've got nothing to lose. And if you have nothing to lose, you have everything to gain in this process. So you relieve yourself of that thought that this is going to be perfect, that you don't want to mess it up. Everything is about learning. In fact, some of my favorite painters, Edgar Payne, you name it, some of those great painters, Sargent and all them, their paintings that are hanging up in galleries, they're just studies. They're beautiful, beautiful studies. And if you get that mindset of thinking that everything you do is just a study, you'll have better success. Try not to set yourself up for failure with the wrong mindset. So, see what that's doing now. With all of that red, this starts to take that gray into kind of a greenish color. But I like that. I don't mind that at all. I'm going to do different things to that gray. We're going to go warmer and cooler. We're going to put a lot of different color into that. But for now, I think that's a good base to start with. Let's move forward and then just kind of knock this shadow down. Mark making, again, not quite as important here. Edge control, not quite as important yet. We'll start getting into that when we put our final marks. But for me, I like to think of my mark making early on, so that way I'm developing my mark making in my rhythms and my memory for those rhythms in certain areas. So as I get to the finish, I've already kind of contemplated and I played around with those rhythms in certain parts of the painting, and I'm going to build off of that. So I know that these marks I put down may not be in the final part of the painting, but they might as well. They might be there as well. So making sure that they're nice. Then I'm going to go into blocking in the water. Now, if you look at the reference of the lake, that lake looks like it's one gigantic pool of turquoise and green. If you're not careful, things like that in a painting can really steal the show. Now, maybe that's what you want it to do. Maybe you want that water in that lake to steal the show and be bright. But for me, I want to control when and where that crescendo happens in a painting. I want that to be here. I want most of the color, meaning the brightest colors in the painting, I'm going to control where those come out. Most of the color I build in the beginning is going to be fairly muted, and the colors are going to be very close together. And then towards the end of the painting, I'll start pushing and pulling on those color bodies. But for now, the water can't be all that different from the rock and the trees and everything else. Right now, it's all about value. Value over color always. You can have wrong color and have the right value, and the painting will still work. It's better to have the right color, but even if it's wrong, as long as your value is true, your designing of your light is true, it's going to work. So for me, I keep all of those things close together. I'm gonna want the color of the water to be at its brightest and most vivid somewhere around here. So for now, I'm going to take this puddle that I already made and I'm going to create my water from that. And this is kind of what I refer to as like recycled color. I like to use a lot of recycled color in my palette. And by doing that, you create a sense of harmony, because in landscape, most landscapes will harmonize and you don't get a lot of bright, vivid separation of colors anyway, unless you're looking at something man-made like painted buildings. So for the water, we're going to put in a lot of our sap greens, our cool greens, our turquoises from that base, and I'm going to get a much more of a muted color. I'm not going to worry about the highlight that I had, because I'm going to paint that highlight back in. I want to make sure that I'm paying special attention to the edge up here. That's got to be really, really straight. You'll see in a lot of areas I have very loose mark making, and then some other areas I have very, very clean, articulate mark making. That's going to be a really important rhythm to how I build that sense of realism into the painting, is to have a sense of chaos and where the edges loosen up, so that way the eyes have something to loosen up on and they're not going to be holding on to, you know, the details. Where you put a sharp edge and where you put a sharp edge against a contrasting color or a contrasting value, the eyes are going to go there. So a lot of times I loosen up my edges a little bit. I loosen up where those colors meet if I don't want you to look there. If I don't need you to look there, I'm going to lose that. You're going to notice over here I'm going to put a little bit more yellow ochre and green and orange, because I'm trying to say that this is the shallows and you're seeing through the water down here, because I really don't want you to look there. This is going to be where the jewel happens, that transparency and that vivid color. So I'm kind of setting up the base for that by putting a lot more warm, earthy color down here. And again, it's just an approximation, but it's feeling nice and dark. I do feel a separation between the color I have up here, and I do feel a distinct body of color down here that's not all that dissimilar from what's going on there. Because if you do look at the landscape, I don't see that the lake is popping all that dissimilarly from the rock. And for me, I'm painting this landscape as warm as I could go. Again, as I referred to before, photographs are usually going to make your images look a lot cooler than they appear, and you're going to lose a lot of color. You usually see most of your color in where the sunlight hits. And in the shadows, they tend to just kind of crash and they go gray and cold and blue. It's hard for me to find my ideal subject, because usually I look for the unexpected. And it's in the unexpected that I find my true statement for art. Inspiration is as good as a warm bath. You know, I feel like in the beginning it feels great, but at some point it eventually goes cold. You need to learn that knowledge and the ability to paint is something you need to pull from within, and then it's always there. It's always inside of you. I started painting when I was a kid. Since my father was an artist, I followed in his footsteps. And it wasn't until I got into college that I started taking art seriously. I also started teaching landscape painting while I was working as a production designer at DreamWorks Animation. And I noticed that the two work in tandem with each other. One informs the other. All the principles I'm teaching in this workshop apply to pretty much any medium you're going to be using for plein air or studio painting, whether it be oil, acrylic, watercolor, or even gouache. You're going to learn a lot about composition and how to make a solid layout, and then we'll go into blocking in a value study and learning how to do theatrical lighting and how lighting tells a story and how to have a great narrative for a great painting. Then we'll go into how to use color and broken color and texturizing a lot of your paint and a lot of marbleizing as well. So hopefully these techniques work as well for you as it does for me.
You know, I think this idea of drama and color and light really applies to all of us. We can make our paintings so much stronger by creating that sense of drama and that sense of light. Mike Hernandez did a fabulous job. We had him in the studio here, and we did an online broadcast, and we're going to share now with you a Q&A that Mike did in the online broadcast.
If there's any questions, I'm free to answer them.
Can we preserve those paints for later, like tonight, another session, tomorrow, next week? Do I put it in the fridge with saran wrap, or is that even doable?
Yes, absolutely. So as to the first part of the question, it's one of the other reasons I like to paint with gouache, because it is easy to clean up. For something like this, as long as the surface is finished, all you would need is clean water, a little bit of clean water, and to wipe away, and this stuff is going to be gone. Now I kind of feel like I'm doing a ShamWow commercial, but you can see how easily that's going to clean up with just water. But as long as the surface is finished. Now, I can't make you any promises if you get the gouache on your clothing, but because the gouache is like a tempera, you know, and it doesn't have a polymer or a resin base in it, you're going to be able to just wipe it right back up with a little bit of water. But watch out for your clothing, you know, make sure that you don't get it on the clothes or on the furniture that doesn't have a finish on it. As for being able to reuse the paint, absolutely. This is why I like using the wet box here. It has a lid on it, and I'll show you what that looks like. And as long as, you know, we're indoors, and if we were outdoors, this would have been fairly dry by now. But that's why you need to have a spray bottle where you can keep spraying it, misting it, and wetting it. But as long as, you know, that stays moist, before I close it up, I would give it one more hit and I would spray it down very, very well. I just wouldn't want to oversaturate it to where all these colors are going to bleed into each other. But you can see they're holding, because the sponge I have in there is fairly, it's a very firm sponge. But once you're done, put a cap on that. You could, and I like to put it in a sealable bag, and you wouldn't even have to put that in the fridge. You just put it in the sealable bag and leave it out. A couple things to keep in mind is the kind of water you're going to be using in here. Now, there's a couple things you could do. A lot of people use spring water or distilled water, and if you use distilled water and you've started from a very, you know, sanitary, clean base, and then you're not really going to have to worry so much about mold in here. But I think at some point you're going to be using different waters or other things, and the agents are possibly going to get in there. So my best bet, every now and then, what I'll do is I'll spray a little bit of peroxide on the lid and then close it up, and that kind of helps things. But ultimately, if you were to keep spraying this down and you use distilled water and you close this and you seal it tightly and you put it in a plastic bag, I've had paints in here last me a good 2 to 3 months, if not more. What will happen is you will get skinning on the tops of the layers of paint. In fact, right now I can probably touch that one and you can see that it's not on my finger. It's formed a skin on it. And that's okay. I'm able to kind of push that over or squeeze from that and get paint out of it. And the skins are not a bad idea when you're finished painting, because what it does is it kind of keeps the rest of the paint on the inside dry and moist. So the skin isn't a bad idea. But out on the field, when you're painting in plein air, once that skin starts to form, it's a good indication that you need to start spraying more water on that again, because it'll start to dry up. And then what happens is you're going to be left over with, let's say, inevitably you're going to have some spots, let's say like that spot right there that's fairly thin, but it's got a buildup on it. That's going to dry out. Once it completely dries out, you cannot use that area again. You can reactivate gouache, but the way I paint so thick that I can't reactivate it. It's going to be like trying to reactivate watercolor, and if you paint like a watercolor, that's fine. Some colors don't reactivate well with water when it comes to gouache, whereas all colors in watercolor are made to reactivate and re-wet. But in some areas, gouache won't, especially the more opaque ones, especially and primarily white. Do not ever try to reactivate white and think that you're going to get a nice opaque buildup with just re-wetting dried up white. It's kind of an endless battle. Unless you are primarily transparent and you want maybe a weak and a faint highlight, then reactivating dry white gouache is fine. Once you do have an area on this sponge that has a dried skin, an area where the paint is dry, you can put another dab of paint, but do not put it right back on top of the old paint, because Underneath that is going to be that dried layer that'll never moisten up again. It'll never let water come through anymore. So then when you put a dab of fresh paint on top of the dry area, it's going to dry faster. So always put fresh paint onto fresh sponge, because in essence, this setup, what I'm doing here, the sponge is only to store my paint. It's not to mix in. I'm not going to mix in there. I do all of my mixing here. I keep all of my paints clean and fresh in here. Other setups that I've seen that are very successful are deep well setups. So you can get the deep wells, like the black containers that have, anywhere from 12 to 24 wells in them, and you squeeze in and you premix your paints and your gouaches in those wells. Because they're so deep, they don't dry out as much, and the light isn't able to hit them quite as well. So deep wells that have a lid that you can put on top after is also another great way to paint outdoors. But I like using this method because I can see the colors closely related to each other. So again, just paint storage, not mixing. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yes. Anyone else? Yes.
The sponge that you're using there, if you change that out basically every time you do a painting, is that correct?
I don't change that sponge out.
Okay, just clean it?
No, I don't change it. I don't do anything with that sponge. So once you put a sponge in there and you put your paints on there, that's good to hold your paints as long as you're sealing it and keeping it wet. That sponge is going to stay in there for the length of the paint, so it can be in there anywhere from, depending on how dry it gets, 1 week to 3 months.
So only if you let it dry out would you have to
Only
change
if
it?
this is all dry, or at the time where you no longer have any place to put fresh paint down, it's all used up and you're done with that, throw it away and get a new one.
Is there a brand that you go with, or is it just kind of a cheap, thin sheet of sponge?
Well, it's a good question, because Masterson's, this is a Masterson Stay Wet. This is what this palette is. And they manufacture their own sponges that come with this, and those are great. But if you're in a fix and you're in a jam, you could always go to the supermarket, and most supermarkets in their cleaning aisles will have these sponges in there, and sponges for cleaning countertops. And as long as the sponge is fairly dense, like this one is, which most of those are because it's all about absorbency and reusable ability, most of those you're going to be able to get those. And this one, in fact, I got it from the supermarket you guys have down here. And they come in this size, so I was able to plop it right in, and it fits just as is without cutting it. Nice. So you don't have to use the Masterson's sponge that comes with. You can use any sponge, like I said, as long as it's not too porous.
Okay. Yeah. And could you go over your colors one more time really quickly?
Go over the colors?
Yeah, just what colors you use.
Absolutely. So again, my favorite palette is a palette that consists of mostly warm colors and a lot of earth colors. When I first started teaching gouache, I used a lot of primaries, things like a basic palette I used to teach in when I first started was to use an azure blue, alizarin crimson, and primary yellow with white. And like a printer, using those as primaries, I would use those as my limited palette for students, and they can mix pretty much any color, almost any color with that. And I found that was too hard for students to learn from in the beginning, because I felt like they didn't mix enough. So if they had azure blue and they had a blue sky, they would just add white to their blue and say that's sky. And if they happen to have something that was yellow in the field, they'd say, well, white with yellow, and that's it. Not knowing that you have to mix all the colors together, all of them in percentages some way or another. And rarely and almost never will you ever use a pure out of the tube color by itself, a primary on a painting. You can, and we do that in animation and in cinema and theater. I like to punctuate moments in a painting or characters in a painting with a primary color and really pop that stylization. But in reality, that rarely ever happens. Even in nature, even if we were outdoors and I saw a building that was painted primary red, and I looked at my palette, I'm not going to take that primary red by itself. I'm still going to incorporate some of the other colors in the palette in that landscape in a very small way to make sure that it fits within the other scope of colors that it's relating to. So in that sense, that's why I always have an extended earth palette. I put a lot more earth tones. I changed my, I know this goes beyond the question you're asked, but it's part of it. I changed my basic limited palette that I used to teach into a palette that had more pre-mixed colors, earth tones. So that way it forced the students to mix with those and see that you need more earth tone, that colors that relate to each other. I would almost suggest if you're going to use just the three, like, cyan, magenta, and yellow kind of a thing with white, you mix a pool of those colors together first, then you take a piece of that and then create a color from it. So that way at least you started with a base of all the colors together and you harmonize. So what I do is it's extended. So I like to use my yellow, and I use I don't use a warm and cool of every color, but I tend to like to do warm and cool, like warm and cool yellow right here, the permanent yellow, but that could be many different yellows. I've used brilliant yellow. I'm not extremely particular about the actual color, with the exception of maybe I love spectrum violet and I love marigold yellow. But any ballpark yellow like this with I love linden green because that's the cool yellow, or like a lime green. Your marigold, and this one is, this is a different one I'm using today. This is brilliant orange. Sometimes you can, instead of brilliant orange, you could use like a medium scarlet lake to get that same color. Because I think of this as my, my cool red, my warm red, my cool red, but that's to me is as red as I'm going to go. If I need to go any redder than that, then mixing, alizarin with that color works just fine. So I've got the warm and cool here, which is my burnt sienna and my alizarin. And then my yellow ochre could have been up here and grouped together with my other colors. It was kind of an afterthought. Ultramarine blue, you could also just use cobalt. Now, depending on the palette, sometimes I've had students take ultramarine and cobalt out of their palette and just use like a sky blue or a primary blue in there, because what happens if you're going to use, if you have spectrum violet, you got to be careful about using spectrum violet in a palette that also has ultramarine, because they're both violet. One is a violet blue and one is more of a violet, like a purplish color, a brilliant violet. So you got to be careful when you have alizarin, spectrum violet, and ultramarine in there. I could have almost, taken that out and just put sky blue because I have so much spectrum violet and alizarin crimson. What's nice to kind of juxtapose those are my other cool, on the other spectrum of the blues. I have my, I think, let's see what that one's called again. The cobalt turquoise over here, and then my permanent green. So there's kind of like a warm and a cool of that color as well. And then, I've got my sap green.
What were those two you just went over? Sorry.
The cobalt?
Yeah, what two cobalts?
So this is cobalt turquoise. They also make a cobalt turquoise light.
Okay.
And then this is a permanent green deep, I think, or just permanent green. But again, the colors aren't as important as just making sure you're ballparking the right warm and cools of every color in there. Sometimes I'll paint with a very, very limited palette. This is a lot of colors, but I wanted to make sure, since I knew I was demoing and a lot of people were going to be using, some people are used to using full ranges of color. I could have definitely gone further and put way more colors on here, but I also probably could have gotten away with a lot less. And looking at my photo, the reference, there's not a lot of color there, so I could have used a fairly limited palette to do this painting. And in fact, sometimes you're better off using a very limited palette so you don't get yourself in trouble. So the more color you put on your palette, the more likely of trouble you're going to get into. The less color you put on there, the less trouble you're going to have. So hopefully that answers.
Yeah, do you think there's a sweet spot for students?
A sweet spot would be probably to use, if I had to recommend a good palette, I would probably say use the permanent yellow, use the Scarlet Lake, use the burnt sienna, yellow ochre, alizarin crimson, use a sky blue, use a burnt umber, and sap green. And I would say that's it.
Okay.
You wouldn't need to use more than that. Be careful with, I would just say be careful with I took the violet out. I just don't think it's a good idea for sometimes, because it's such a crutch of a color, people tend to see a lot of violet in landscape because of default of what happens to things that kind of have a lot of yellow in it versus things that don't have any yellow in it. They tend to feel violet, the grays feel violet compared to like yellow or green trees and things like that. So people tend to see that and say, oh, that looks like spectrum violet, so they'll add white to violet and you get too much purple in a painting. So you got to be really careful about how you use that spectrum violet. I rarely ever use it in its purity. I like to mix it into my browns and my greens and other colors as well, but I try not to think of that color as the literal sense. So for beginners, I tend to take that, like the violets and the candy greens, I tend to take those colors out. Permanent green is a scary color. I tend to see students just making their trees or the shadows of their trees just permanent green deep straight, not mixing enough of all of the other colors in there. So sometimes I'll take those colors out of a palette.
Thank you.
Sure. Anyone else?
Yeah, we still have a couple questions coming in online.
Yeah.
We have a question from Josh that says, when you're out plein air painting, what methods do you use to size and distance shapes from one another in the distance?
It is a very good question. The way I do that is I tend to think of the image I'm painting as a tapestry, almost like I'm looking at cut out pieces of origami and how those shapes come together. For example, if I wanted to know how to relate a group of shapes in the foreground to a group of shapes in the background, and trying to figure out how those shapes perspect and how the road perspects and how all of those things perspect. If I'm thinking of it as dimensional and deep, trying to sketch it that way, I tend to kind of mess things up because I'm trying to think of too many things all at once, like perspective, foreshortening, all those other different things. Rather, what I do is I group things a lot. First of all, I won't think of all these distinct shapes. I'll start off as families and I'll group things first and say, okay, well, let's take all of these things together and just kind of, first simplify the notion of size and say all of these things in a group versus all of those things in a group and those things in a group versus that one massive shape. When I do that, I then think of all those groups, instead of in perspective, I think of it as cut out pieces. So for example, if I have a road that's diminishing into perspective, instead of thinking of it in depth, I say, what does that road look like if it was a piece of origami and I cut it out as a piece of paper? Then I say, what is that shape? It helps me think of proportion better, and it helps me think of the actual shape that's going to perspect. So then what I tend to do is I think of everything in my landscape of puzzle pieces fitting together. Not depth, but the mountain in the distance, the barn in front of it, the road leading to it, they're all puzzle pieces. So that to me helps me distinguish one shape from the next, because first I simplify and I group those things. I try not to create the perspecting lines. I always think in perspective. I always think of where the horizon line is going to be, and sometimes I'll loosely indicate that on my canvas. But that's what helps me in comparing shapes. And then if you guys recalled, I don't know if you're able to still refer to this painting here, but if you guys recall earlier in the painting when I was sketching, I referred to shapes based on proportions and ratios of how one thing relates to another. When I sketched out this shape here, and then I wanted to know the next shape compared to it, how big it was supposed to be, well, if I looked at them and broke them into relative shapes, if I took this shape and I doubled it, it would end there. That told me that I had another halfway to go above that. So sometimes what I like to do is I find proportions that work, and then I use that. If it's close to the other one, I'll use that as a measuring tool and say, okay, well, how many of those make that over there, for an example? So that's one way, or a couple ways I'll do things to find proportions of shapes and how they perspect.
Cool. We have another question from Judy Notifora that says, what do you put over your finished paintings? Do you use a varnish?
That is a really good question, and it's been the subject of many, many debates. Went on for days and days on Facebook once on a post where people were talking about varnishing, your pieces. For example, I treat it like a watercolor. I don't put any varnishes on it, and most people don't treat their watercolors. You just put it behind glass. When I sell my paintings, I sell them without glass. So when I put them up in a show, I would put this painting, for example, in a plein air frame because I painted it like an oil, and it's painted traditionally like an oil, not really like a watercolor. So in that sense, it deserves to be painted in a frame if I painted it like an oil painting. And it would actually hold up, and I always had cautions about that. I don't put it in really dark. For example, I don't put it in a black frame because the darks in here don't go as dark as an oil would. But I'll put it in like a medium dark frame or a light gold frame. But I won't put any glass behind it because I don't like the look of glass over the painting. But when I sell the paintings, I always recommend to the buyers that they protect it behind glass. The best look for that is to put non-glare glass over it, like what they call museum glass or den glass. That's glass that has no reflection. Because if you had a regular piece of glass over an oil painting that's framed like a plein air painting, that's going to look kind of funny. And the reason oil paintings don't need that, because oils can be varnished and they can be protected. A gouache does need to be protected from the elements, so you do need to put some sort of glass over it. There are other people who've debated different methods, like using different wax-like varnishes, beeswax. I've heard all the different methods. Some people have said they've never seen any change when they do a varnish on it. Other people have said, yeah, it changes the contrast ratios. Other people talk about crystal clears and spray varnishes and fixatives where you just do fine dusting of varnish over it. But I found that even when you do that, it either somehow, somewhere in there, it can change something. So I've never been able to use a varnish in there that didn't do something. But I'm not saying you couldn't. It's still up for debate, and I'm still open to that, but I don't spray or varnish any of my works.
Okay, we have another question from Mike Pelosi, who says, do you ever use black, or do you refrain from having pure blacks in the painting?
Good question. Do I use it? Yes. Sometimes I'll just grab a black, but I use it as a mediator of something kind of to get me into a dark color or a dark value. But the reason I don't teach with black is because students tend to use it as a shorthand and a shortcut for value. And if you want to go and learn about color, you don't want to shorthand all the lessons that could be learned about mixing to get to your darks, or all the steps taken. Anytime you change value is an opportunity to change temperature, hue, chroma, saturation, and whatnot. Plus, in a painting, we don't go 100% black, nor do we go 100% white. If you go 100% black, that is taking paint to the surface of the board, and it'll look like paint on a board. It'll look like black paint on a board, or black ink. If you go 100% white, and there's no value in that either, it's going to look like white paint on a board. Now, if it's a small area on a painting, on a giant painting, you put a small dab of pure white or a small dab of pure black, it's not going to be a problem. That's going to work. But if you have some giant areas of darks and some areas of bright highlights that you're using pure white, unless it's meant to be stylized that way, it's going to look flat. So you always want to remain in value and remain in color. That being said, if you took a straight Mars black and put it on a board, I bet you I can get a black that I used out of all my colors that'll look even deeper. So warm colors want to go into the board, and then the cool colors want to come forward on a board. And I've heard it challenged in many other ways, which is fine, but in my experience, the warmer colors tend to want to build more depth in a painting. And that's been true with a black. I've seen a pastel from an artist who does pastel. I think his name is Hurley Brown. And he has this real poisonous stick of pastel. It's like a cadmium black. It's black with a little bit of cadmium red in it. And when he uses that on his pictures, it looks like he punched a hole into the surface of the board that he's using, because it's got so much warmth in it. It creates more depth in there, if you want depth. And that's what darks are. They're just things that kind of recess anyway. So I try not to use black, because black tends to feel too flat. But I have, sometimes I like to stylize and take risks. Remember, these are things that I say, these are never rules. They're just guidelines, and they're all meant to be broken. I've seen some beautiful results with people who just decide to challenge all those theories and use black in a painting. But it's not necessarily very traditional. They just get a different effect with it. So traditionally, no, but stylistically, yes, you can use black.
Okay, we have another question from Boone, and this one's in reference to shadow. He says, I'm still confused by the concept of warm canopy you mentioned. I thought shadow is supposed to be cool.
Again, so good question, and I know that tends to be very, very confusing, and it took me a while to figure that out. More of it made sense when I worked in animation and I saw a light set up in the computer and how they actually light an actual environment in a 3D movie. And I saw them put the big canopy. Now, the canopy fill is never warm. I think what he's referring to is the overall fill, the ambient fill of an environment in sunlight is warm. That's all the bounce light accumulating and adding up to the fill from the warm sunlight. The shadows aren't inherently blue, but they do have blue in them. But they're not void of warmth in them. They may not be quite as hot or as warm as what's in the sunlight, but there is warmth in that shadow. Where you see the presence of blue, is usually in the upward facing planes of those shadows. So in my painting here, things that started to go into the deeper shadows that weren't receiving any of that warm fill light started to pick up that inherited blue from the sky above that was filling the downward facing planes. That also happens if you were to go outside, and if you were in the shadow and you put your hand upward facing in shadow, but the sky was able to hit your hand, you would see all that blue from the sky. But then if you tilted your hand up at an angle where the concrete was hitting sunlight and your hand is still in the shadow, you're going to see a lot of that warm bounce light hit and fill your hand, which does say, yes, there's a lot of warm light in the shadow. Now, what I was trying to say in my painting with all this warmth isn't so much just the warmth from all the environment, but I'm saying this giant lake is illuminated and it's warm and it's bouncing and it's glowing and it's bouncing up against those walls. It was kind of conceptual in that way as well. So the upward facing planes of a shadow are going to feel bluer. They're not going to be pure blue, but you're going to mix your local color and you're going to add a little bit more blue into that with a white to kind of feel like, okay, the blue sky is mixing into that upward facing plane or slightly glancing angles before you go 90 degrees and the sky can no longer hit that glance. The other way you get blue into the shadows is through gaining more atmosphere. So as those shadows start to go further and further away in the landscape, you start to get more of the atmosphere of the sky itself, and all those particles will then start to fill those shadows, and then you'll start to see more blue. So all that says is the mountain is, or the objects are so much further away that the shadows are just filling with blue. But in the extreme foreground, in a photograph, everything looks blue because that's the way the camera perceives it. It simplifies it that way. In real life, look again, you'll see that the shadow isn't blue. Maybe the cast shadow is blue. And the whiter and the purer the object would be in shadow, the more blue it's going to inherit on those upward facing planes.
Okay, we have an anonymous question now. How do you keep your gouache from looking chalky?
That is another great question, and that evolves from how you mix it. Usually a chalky painting comes from adding white to a color and then not readjusting its temperature. So sometimes someone will take, for example, a leaf that is in sunlight, and they'll take white and add it to an olive green or a sap green, and they'll get a highlight, and then there'll be even a brighter highlight on top of that, so they'll add more white to that, and then it'll just go chalky. So what happens is you have to, when you add white to a color, you cool it or you neutralize it. You don't make it warmer. So as you're building highlights to warm sunlight, you have to manufacture your warm transitions into that color. So if I've got burnt sienna and it's a skin tone and I add white and I put that down and then I have another lighter value of skin turning before it gets to the highlight and I added white to that again, I then need to either add more yellow ochre or orange to continue it going warmer so that way it doesn't in return look chalky. So you'll notice you'll never get a chalky painting when you don't use white, and if you were just to use your paints like pure watercolor and tint, you'll never get chalk. Chalk comes from the white adding to the color and not reinforcing that color with more warmer temperatures as you go lighter. So that's where the chalky color comes in.
Okay, and our last question comes from Mary, and she says, was the initial block-in dry before the color block-in?
Was it dry?
Yes, before you started.
Yes, absolutely. The paint on here dries immediately once I put it down in an environment like this. You know, even if it's fairly wet, it'll be dry at least within 5 minutes. And it's not a bad thing for it to be wet in certain areas, because sometimes I like to work wet into wet to kind of get some bleeding edges and let some of the undertone start to bleed through and mix with that color. But in this case, yes, it was dry before I even got into it.
Well, that was a little snippet of an online broadcast that we did with Mike Hernandez when he was here in the studios. We hope you enjoyed creating drama with color and light. I'm Eric Rhodes. Make sure to continue to keep your head in the right place and keep growing. We'll see you.
It's hard for me to find my ideal subject because usually I look for the unexpected, and it's in the unexpected that I find my true statement for art. Inspiration is as good as a warm bath. You know, I feel like in the beginning it feels great, but at some point it eventually goes cold. You need to learn that knowledge and the ability to paint is something you need to pull from within, and then it's always there. It's always inside of you. I started painting when I was a kid. Since my father was an artist, I followed in his footsteps. And it wasn't until I got into college that I started taking art seriously. I also started teaching landscape painting while I was working as a production designer at DreamWorks Animation, and I noticed that the two work in tandem with each other. One informs the other. All the principles I'm teaching in this workshop apply to pretty much any medium you're going to be using for plein air or studio painting, whether it be oil, acrylic, watercolor, or even gouache. You're going to learn a lot about composition and how to make a solid layout, and then we'll go into blocking in a value study and learning how to do theatrical lighting and how lighting tells a story and how to have a great narrative for a great painting. Then we'll go into how to use color and broken color and texturizing a lot of your paint and a lot of marbleizing as well. So hopefully these techniques work as well for you as it does for me.